Uranus turns retrograde on August 28th. Does this bring a pause to the craziness of the past few months, giving us a chance to catch our collective breath? Maybe. Next on Horoscope Highlights.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Astrology Hub's Academy. Wherever you are on your astrology journey, we have a class that will help you get to the next level.
Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. And this week, I wanted to talk to you about Uranus turning retrograde on August 28th, which will then be followed by Venus coming out of retrograde on September 3rd. Let me go ahead and break this down for you. Uranus retrograde. Now, Uranus, as we all know, is the first of the three modern planets. The modern planets are Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. These are the planets in astrology that were discovered after the year 1781. 1781 basically makes a break between the ancient or traditional planets and the modern, or what's sometimes called the transformative planets. The modern planets were never visible to the eyes of ancient civilizations. That's why they weren't recorded or used in the astrological pantheon. It's because of the telescope that they then were discovered and were introduced as three intriguing players into the cast of characters that we know in astrology. Uranus is the planet of revolution and change. Uranus is perhaps the most disruptive and the most unpredictable of the three modern planets. The next modern planet, Neptune, discovered in 1846, is the planet of illusion and disillusionment. And Pluto, discovered in 1930, at the midpoint between the beginning of World War I and the end of World War II, is the planet of Thanatos, basically the planet of ordeals and the transformations that arise from them. So these three are very, very powerful planets. And they're also understood as the transpersonal planets because when you contrast them to the personal planets like Mercury, Venus, or Mars, they're the most remote and perhaps the most indifferent when it comes to the concerns that we have here on the planet Earth. Nevertheless, since 1781, and also since the discovery of Neptune and Pluto, which follows Uranus's discovery in 1781, astrologers have been able to sort of sketch out kind of portraits or profiles of these planets. What we have to remember is that the ancient planets, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, they've been around since the beginning of astrology, which is a little over 2,500 years. So we've had a lot of time to absorb these planets and their meaning. We've had a lot of time to paint the portrait of the sun, to discuss the character of the moon, and to explore all the particulars of Mercury. So we've had a lot of time to sort of use these players in our cast of characters and to truly acquaint ourselves with them. And we, of course, in astrology have a tremendous history where their comings and goings, their direct motions, and their retrogrades have been recorded since basically Sumeria to nowadays. The modern planets have only been around for 200 plus years, and we're still sketching out what they mean. So, when a planet like Uranus turns retrograde refers to an apparent backwards motion. The planet doesn't actually move backwards in the sky because if it did, we'd all be in a lot of trouble. But it's based on an optical illusion where it looks as if from the Earth's point of view, the planet has suddenly stopped in its course and moving back in the sky. This is something that we can see with Venus. It's something we can clearly see with Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. But with the moderns, we can't really see it, but we can note it through our ability to observe them through observatories, etc. So if Uranus is the planet of revolution and change, and that's what it does, is it moves forward in the heavens, what happens when it turns retrograde? Retrograde, a backwards motion, was always associated to a turnabout in the character of the planet, an about face. The about face of the motion of the planet, where it was moving forward, stops, and then starts moving backwards, was sort of seen as the other face, the hidden face of the planet, usually contradictory to the way that the planet normally acts. Mercury, which is associated with buying and selling, when moving forward, was the favorite planet of shopkeepers. But when moving backwards, Mercury became the favorite planet of shoplifters. In contrast or in contradiction to before, instead of buying and selling, now there was thievery and stolen items. Venus, which is coming out of retrograde this week, Venus moving forward is the planet of love and beauty. So when Venus is moving backwards, Venus is the opposite of love and beauty. Venus, the planet of what I like in astrology, it's really the planet that rules the law of attraction. Her job is to bring people into your life who are like you. They may share your humor, they may share your tastes, they may share your political proclivities. So Venus is all about like. The best way to think of Venus is collecting hearts on your Instagram page or your Facebook page or your TikTok or whatever the hell we're signed up for these days, Threads or something. Anyway, so Venus is all about, heart, 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 heart. I like. So this is what Venus does when she moves forwards. Since Venus has been backwards, she's attracting what I don't like. Okay, so it could be unwanted attention, unholy bores, people who really rub you the wrong way or are completely disagreeable. And so Venus, who was always associated to peace and prosperity, usually in her retrograde was associated to war or conflict or some sort of combat. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what's been going on in your life. But if you've been noticing people not being as friendly as they used to be or giving you the cold shoulder, just kind of like looking at you that way at work, well, that's Venus retrograde. It always makes one wonder, do I have halitosis? Did I use deodorant today? Like, why is everyone looking at me like I'm hideous? Okay, that's Venus retrograde. This is what she does. So when we think of Uranus moving forward as being the planet of revolution and change, well, does that mean that we have a respite? That Uranus is not going to be unpredictable for the next 5 months, that it's going to behave, that we're going to have an opportunity to sort of catch our collective breath and sit down and try to make sense of all this craziness that Uranus has brought into our lives, particularly following on the heels of the recent Sun-Uranus square? Not really. I apologize because I want to say yes, and it's going to be reflective and you can understand these things. No, this isn't what Uranus does. And it's not, honestly, really what the modern planets do. The thing that sometimes we forget as astrologers is that the modern planets spend as much time moving forward as they do moving backward. All right? So Uranus, I think, spends 5 months in retrograde and maybe 6.5-ish in direct. So if you look at a year, Uranus is forward as much as backwards for half the year. And the same thing is going to be applicable to Neptune and Pluto because of their distant orbits. So this is what also makes the modern planet so enigmatic. When ancient planet, which through humanistic astrology were called the personal planets because we could kind of identify with them, when they're moving forward, then we feel like our life is moving in sync and everything wonderful is happening. And then when they're moving backwards, it's kind of a cough or an interruption or a strange prelude or an undiscovered tangent that suddenly comes up. But we're kind of rest assured that things will be back to normal when it goes forward. Like if Mercury comes out retrograde, we're like, okay, now I can buy and sell with confidence because Mercury is out of retrograde and it's not going to bedevil my life anymore. With the moderns, we really can't tell, is Neptune really about illusion or is it really about disillusionment? Is Pluto really about this underworld journey that promises transformation, or is this underworld journey going to be as bad as the ills that we are trying to remedy? So it's hard to tell which side the modern planet is really on. If Uranus is revolution and change, always introducing something that's unpredictable or an unforeseen twist, Does the retrograde sort of give you a chance to, I don't know, go backwards because it is a retrograde and try to rectify the twist, or to try to find some kind of sense in it, or maybe even have a round two where you could make things better?
Hello, I'm Judith Hill. I've worked with medical astrology since 1983, following a decade and a half in a full-service astrological practice, and I witnessed firsthand just how powerful it can be. I'm very excited to teach about medical astrology of the sun signs, their assigned organs, strengths, and potential health vulnerabilities in my workshop entitled The 12 Zodiac Signs in Medical Astrology: Bodily Rulerships, Functions, and Symptomology. This workshop is part of Astrology Hub's upcoming Health, Wealth, and Fulfillment workshop series, and I can't wait to share with you the tips, idiosyncrasies, special preferences, and all kinds of interesting facts about the 12 zodiac signs that will be very practical indeed in your life work with astrology and your self-knowledge. So I hope that you will all enjoy this wonderful workshop coming up. To register, just go to astrologyhub.com/Judith Workshop.
So, keeping in mind that we have Uranus turning retrograde this week, followed by Venus coming out of retrograde this week, the retrograde being a reversal of face, a reversal of the things that we expect, and the coming out of retrograde being a restoration in some sense. And we're dealing with Uranus, which is a planet that's connected to unpredictability, and Venus, which is a planet that's connected to love and beauty. Well, it put me in mind of a favorite episode of mine from Star Trek, the first time Star Trek came out in the 60s. Yes, I'm that old. But it put me in mind of the first version of Star Trek that came out, the version that had Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy and Lieutenant Uhura. And there was this very, very special episode that I thought really brings together the idea of Uranus and Venus and the changings of direction. And it's the story of this episode that I want to share with you today. The name of this episode was The City on the Edge of Forever. And it was kind of the breakout episode for Star Trek because it took it out of, phasers and tricorders and aliens and things like that, and into something that was very dramatic and very profound, and also very hard to wrap your mind around in terms of a paradox or dilemma. And science fiction has connected to it with a kind of prophetic ability. It looks into the future. It's about the future. It's about us speculating about the future. Is it going to be utopian or dystopian? But with this one, what was really beautiful is that it addressed the issue of time and time travel. It was written by Harlan Ellison. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was an extremely famous science fiction writer in the 60s. And he wrote this episode, and it really dealt with kind of a question of if you could go back in time and fix something, would you? Now, we've all thought about that. If only I could go back in time and make a different decision, or have realized that famous mug of mine was precariously balanced on the edge of the kitchen counter and not turned around, with great force of expression and set my elbow into it and it crashing down to the floor. Could I go back in time and tell someone that I would never see again, perhaps a dying parent or relative or sibling, the things that I should have said? Could I, if I could go back in time and make different decisions, would I? And what would be the repercussions of that? Now, nowadays, this is a pretty common motif in science fiction. We have lots of shows dealing with time travel, and if it's not time travel, it's alternate realities and timelines, all these sorts of things where just a different choice takes someone down a completely different road. And all of this is in the realm of Uranus. Uranus is a planet named after the god of eternity. He was associated with the heavens in Greek mythology, the starry, starry night, in which you could see stars that went on forever and ever and ever. And so this is why Uranus was associated with eternity. And he is overthrown as the king of heaven by his son Kronos, or time. So we exist within time. Saturn rules the seventh heaven. It was the outermost planet until the discovery of the moderns. We exist within time, but outside of time, outside that seventh heaven, outside that boundary that Saturn set, lies Uranus, or lies eternity. So Uranus, you can think of quite easily, has a kind of bird's eye view of time, where we live on our yesterdays, our present moments, and our tomorrows. All of this makes no sense to Uranus's point of view. I mean, what is the purpose of a yesterday, today, and tomorrow when there is no division of those three? So that kind of leads someone to be like, oh, Uranus blows my mind. Okay, and it does. And when Uranus intervenes, it's almost in a way like eternity intervening in time. That's why it's associated to sudden upsets, sudden revelations, sudden discoveries, sudden accelerations forward, like when there's a scientific discovery or something like that that changes all of humanity, and also crushing regret, like why did I open up that Pandora's box? All of these things are connected to Uranus. So at the beginning of this episode in Star Trek, the Starship Enterprise is monitoring. It's on its 5-year mission to explore worlds, etc. And it's monitoring time warp distortions around this particular planet. It's been drawn to the planet because there's these strange reverberations coming from it that the crew on the bridge picks up on, and they come and orbit this planet. And there are these strange sort of time disruptions that are taking place. Not that it's affecting the Enterprise because it's off-world, but it's shaking the ship and causing turbulence and causing Lieutenant Uhura to go, oh, because she always does that every episode. So in this moment where it's shaking the ship as it is orbiting this planet to observe these time disruptions, I think it's Lieutenant Sulu, suddenly something electrifies and explodes on his driving panel or something like that. He falls to the ground unconscious. And so they immediately call for Dr. McCoy, who comes to the bridge. McCoy's always surly and cranky, and he's like, why are we orbiting this planet? And people are getting hurt. Look at Sulu. And, yes, I can revive him with this drug or something. And they're like, fine, doctor. And we're just about done gathering our information or something like this. So Dr. McCoy bends over Sulu, who's unconscious, and he's about to give him this shot, which will, revive Sulu, and so he can take him down to medical quarters or whatever. But there's a shake of the ship, and accidentally McCoy stabs himself with the shot. Okay, and he goes crazy. It's like, he's suddenly on, drugs or something like this. He just, his eyes bulge. DeForest Kelley was so good at this. His eyes bulge and, he goes crazy and he goes running off. They're like, McCoy's running off and we have to restrain him. He took this drug and now we have to restrain him. And so they go running after McCoy. And I think Chekhov notes that on the transporter that someone has beamed down to the planet. And of course, it's McCoy, who's in a frenzy. Okay, a mad, insane frenzy. And so he's beamed down to this planet. And so Uhura and Kirk and Spock and Scotty, I don't know why Scotty went, but anyway, they all go down to the planet as well. Scotty has to go because you can't do anything without Scotty. Anyway, so they all go down to the planet to look for McCoy. And they happen to beam down at the epicenter of these disturbances, which is this gateway, which is occupied by some sort of sentient being that calls itself the Guardian. And Kirk and Spock, they're scientists. So they're like, what is this character? What is this gateway? And it addresses them. And it says that it actually can give access to different points of time. And so they're like, oh, that's what these disturbances were, or this is the reason for the disturbances. And so their scientific mind and curiosity takes over. And so they're like, well, can you demonstrate this? And the Guardian is like, yes, you can. And it kind of scrolls through time like you would like on an iPhone or something like that. It scrolls through time and they're all like, I mean, come on, what would you be like if all of a sudden you're encountering a being that can scroll through time and show you, all the centuries that have been lived on your planet as well as everyone else's? You'd be like transfixed. And so they are. It's at that moment where they're scrolling through like United States history in the 20th century that McCoy bursts onto the scene. He's been watching them. He's still frenzy and crazy where he accidentally shot himself, and they try to stop him, and he jumps on into this circular structure, okay, where he is immediately vanishes and it stops, and they're like, oh my goodness, what has happened? And the Guardian says, your comrade has gone back to a certain time in your past. And they're like, well, how can we find him? How can we retrieve him? Spock has his tricorder and he's been monitoring what time that was, Kirk tries to call up to the Enterprise, the starship, and nobody's answering. And he's like, why is nobody answering? Like, why can't I, Uhura, can you try? Or Scotty, can you? And so they take out their, communication devices and the starship doesn't answer. And the Guardian says, well, the starship isn't answering you because the Enterprise no longer exists. And they're like, no longer exists. What do you mean? And Kirk's never like, he's like, what do you mean? Like, Kirk is Aries. He always challenges. What do you mean it no longer exists? And the Guardian says, because everything that has been altered. It has been changed. And he's like, everything that we know, there is no federation of planets. The Guardian says there is no great alliance of different planets and the stars. That never came to be. And they're like, how did this not come to be? And he says, your friend changed something in time and has changed the outcome of everything you know. Now, this brings up a fascinating idea about Uranus and how Uranus operates. In our world, okay, we refer to Uranus as being the planet of revolution and change, the planet of unpredictability. It always throws us the wild curves out of left field, okay? And that's pretty much how Uranus is interpreted in astrology. When it comes into a zodiac sign, like, for instance, what Taurus has been experiencing since 2018, it will immediately overturn all the fixtures in your life. And you are left to try to make sense of it, or at least salvage the situation. But there was another understanding of Uranus, a kind of higher plane understanding of Uranus, is that Uranus is moving according to a plan or blueprint which you don't know about. It's not one that you've constructed for yourself in your life, but it's one that's operating in your life. And that these upsets, many humanistic astrologers would speculate that these upsets were actually meant to sort of bring you back on track to living your life, okay? Which was a hopeful way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is you have to deal with upsets, unpredictability, a change, a sudden twist of fate or change of circumstances, and how do you make sense of this in some way? But it also introduced this idea. I want to get back to the earlier idea that the earlier humanistic astrologers had of rectifying things, that you had gotten off track and now you need to go back and rectify or correct something which has been made broken. So in other words, it's kind of this idea there's no such thing as an accident or coincidence. There's this idea that there's a higher sort of like flight plan, or that this is something that's meant to be. What we see in this particular dilemma is that someone has gone back, in this case, it's Dr. McCoy, he's gone back and he's changed a timeline, okay? And is this the timeline? Is this the way that time is supposed to be? We won't know, because Uranus, the possibilities of Uranus are as infinite as the stars in the sky. What we do know for Captain Kirk and Spock and Uhura is that this is their timeline. And so they need to go and correct it. And that's kind of, in a way, the charge or the challenge that Uranus gives us in life is almost kind of like, it's not like protecting our timeline per se. I mean, but it is kind of really trying to decipher the course. When we're taken off course, which Uranus is so famous for, how do we get back on course? And is this the right course that we should be on? Now, in this particular dilemma, the circumstances are pretty easy to see and understand. I mean, there's no Starship Enterprise anymore, and there's no Federation. So they need to go back and they need to fix things, which is why Kirk and Spock jump through this portal. Spock asks the Guardian to replay what they were scrolling through, and he does. And this portal has mists, and you can see, the building of Egypt pyramids and Greece and medieval ages. And, they get up to the 20th century, and it's actually, you see Nazi armies beginning to march, and Spock says, jump. And so he and Kirk jump. They jump into the portal. This is where Dr. McCoy, or Bones, which is his nickname, this is where he had jumped. And so they emerge in 1930s America. It's New York City, 1930s America. And it's basically at the height of at the beginning of the Depression. And so they emerge here, and, you can see these 1930s cars and things like this and honking, and they're still in their uniforms from the 23rd century or wherever they're from. And so immediately they have to go and change and put on, outfits that are available, clothes that are available. They take them off a clothesline. And so they kind of look like, hobos. Everybody actually looks like hobos because this is the Depression and everyone's penniless. In fact, when they emerge out of a wall, they're espied by a hobo who's drinking, and he looks at them and they look at him, and he goes back to drinking, and it's like a laugh line. But anyway, so they find clothes and put them on, and they're like, how are we going to find Bones? And, Spock still has his tricorder, which is working. Kirk still has his communications device, and they kind of, wander the Bowery, which is where they've wound up. And in their looking or inspection of different places, they meet a woman whose name is Edith Keeler, played by Joan Collins before her Dynasty days. And it's actually one of the great roles she's ever played. It's really, really wonderful. And Edith Keeler runs this halfway house. And she's kind of like a one-woman Salvation Army. She takes in, the people who are down on their luck, and she gives them things to do and stuff like that. And so she is kind of taken with Spock's height. Spock has grabbed a cap to cover his pointed ears, and she's quite taken with Kirk, who's very handsome, and she's kind of like, what's going on with you guys? And Kirk is like, we're down on our luck and things are really rough. And, Spock just simply nods. And she's like, well, I run this house, this flop house, and you're welcome to come on in and to rest up until you can get back on your feet again. But I am going to ask you to do chores, and Kirk says, absolutely. And so what begins is about maybe 2 weeks of time where Kirk and Spock are living at this flop house, and Kirk does chores for Edith Keeler, and they help with the soup kitchen and giving out clothes and food to people and things like this. And over this time, of course, Kirk falls in love with Edith Keeler. I mean, it's Joan Collins. How can you not fall in love with Joan Collins? And she's really beautiful. And so he falls in love with her, and she, just really has a beautiful way with people. She has a compassion. She notices that there's something strange with Spock. I mean, those eyebrows are really tweezed and they're arched up and things like that. But she kind of laughs it off or looks the other way. Well, during this time, while they're trying to find McCoy, and they've got a tricorder and a communication device, they're trying to find McCoy. Spock is actually able to access into the Guardian's history reel. Okay. And so what he accesses here is that there's going to be he comes across a newspaper page which features a photograph of Edith Keeler, and she's and there's a photograph, and Kirk is like, well, let's zero in on this. And Spock does. And it's an article about Edith Keeler in the newspaper, but it's an obituary. It's an obituary that describes her having died in a traffic accident, which is just like a couple of days later than the day that they are there. And Kirk is like, oh my goodness, is this like meant to be? Is this fated to happen? And Spock is like, well, it's only logical to assume that there's going to be a traffic accident. And Kirk is like, does McCoy have something to do with it? I mean, there must be some reason we are drawn here. And Spock is like, nah, and at that moment, the tricorder goes blank and whatever vacuum tubes from radios he's been able to put together blow out and he can't possibly access this again. And of course, it's at this time, unbeknownst to Kirk and Spock, that McCoy comes out of this wall, which is, I guess, the entrance place between the Guardian and this current time. That McCoy comes out and he's screaming. He's still in his frenzied state, and he's scaring the other hobos, and they go running and things like this. And he tries to, he's kind of like half mad, and he tries to collect himself and things like this. And he actually gets clothes and puts them on, and he presents himself to Edith Keeler, who happens to be walking, and she's like, well, what's happened to you? You look awful. And he's like, I can't remember. And she's like, please come with me, because she's very Piscean, this character. She has a big heart, a loving soul. And so McCoy goes with her, and she's like, you need a place where you can sleep this off, where you can recollect yourself and come on in here and things like that. And it's like, I just need a place to sleep. And so McCoy comes on into the house and, of course, is led upstairs just as Spock is coming up from the basement and walks through the entryway. I mean, they completely miss each other. And so McCoy gets a chance to sort of sleep things off. And Edith Keeler administers to him, with a bowl of cold water and washcloth on his head because he's feverish. And she administers to him. And so eventually what happens is that another day passes. And in that time, Spock is able to put together the machine, and they can run the tricorder again. Kirk wants to know, like, how did she die? What were the circumstances? Was McCoy there? And so he's desperate to know. And it's at this point that what comes up is a movie reel from the same period of time. And again, there's a picture of Edith Keeler, but this time, instead of being on the obituary page, her face is featured on the front page of a newspaper. And so she's on the front page of the newspaper, and Spock has already had a chance to study it. And so he's reviewing this, and he explains this to Captain Kirk. He's like, this is a version where she doesn't die. And Kirk is like, oh, thank goodness, and he said, but it's far worse. And Kirk is like, what? Why? And he said, here, she is being celebrated. This is the newsreel. And so he shows the newsreel. She's being celebrated as a pacifist, that she's recognized for the work that she's done in the mission, in the Bowery, preaching peace and pacifism. And she becomes so popular that she is seen by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and she has influence on Roosevelt, and she convinces Roosevelt not to enter World War II, but to really extend the hand of peace to all the countries in the world, which is laudable. This is a good thing. But what happens is that this peace movement becomes so popular in America, which was already reluctant to have anything to do with the war that was going on in Europe. This peace movement becomes so popular in America that America never joins the war. America doesn't start the atomic the atomic bomb construction. And so as a result, the Nazis are the first to invent the atom bomb. And so they win World War II. They become the dominating power on planet Earth, and they win World War II, and everything that Kirk and Spock know, the Federation with its mission to come in peace, which is to explore planets that have never been explored before, to really invite everyone into this sort of Jupiterian vision of a federation of planets where everyone contributes and has cultural exchange, the federation never comes to be. And the powers that we know who, had won and were propelled forward as a result of World War II, the opposite happens, and America is conquered like everyone else. And all of this because of Edith Keeler. So we go to that evening, and Kirk has invited Edith Keeler out on a date to go see a movie. And they're walking back from the movie, and they pass by this bridge. It's like the Brooklyn Bridge. And he, points out the different stars in the sky. And she's, what are the, and she's actually talking about her vision of peace and the way that the world could be, where all nations and races come together. And it begins with people not harming one another. It begins with people putting down their weapons and not harming one another, and really pushing themselves to bridge their differences and to live together. And Kirk smiles because he's so enamored of her, and he says, well, one day that's exactly what's going to happen. And she's like, really? How do you know that? And he's like, one day in the future, there will be a place where people do that. And it won't just be Earth. There will be worlds outside of Earth and galaxies that respond to exactly the vision that you're talking about. And she's like, you're so strange. And he's like, yeah. And she's like, you remind me of someone else that I just ran into. His name's Dr. McCoy. And he also was talking about, and Kirk stops and he's like, McCoy, do you know where he is? And she's like, oh yes. Do you know him? He was so distracted and blathering on about things. And he's like, wait here. And she's like, have I said something to upset you? And he's like, stay in this spot. Do not move. And Kirk turns around and he's like, Spock, and he sees Spock from across the street, and Spock looks up and he's like, McCoy's here. And at that moment, McCoy's coming out of the flop house, and he's like, Jim, Spock, and they're like, McCoy, and so the three, Kirk goes running across the street, and he grabs McCoy and Spock, and they're just so happy to have found each other, but of course at this moment, Edith is like, they know each other, and this looks lovely. So she steps off the street curb, and she begins to walk towards them, and Kirk turns around, and at that moment there's a honking from a truck, and she's walking across the street to join the three gentlemen that she knows, and Kirk turns around to go for her, and at that moment Spock says, Captain, stop. And so Kirk stops. And at that moment, McCoy goes lunging forward to get her out of the way of this truck, and Kirk turns around and he grabs McCoy and he stops him in his track. And at that moment, you hear this honk and this crash and people screaming, and Edith Keeler is dead on the street. I know but as a kid, and McCoy is held there, and DeForest Kelley is such a great actor, and he just, do you know what you did? And he, it's shot so that he's looking down, and you just see Kirk's shoulder, and Kirk is holding him, and there are tears streaming down his face. And McCoy's like, I could have saved her. Do you know what you did? And Spock says, yes, Doctor. The captain knows exactly what he did. And it's at that moment that they are then taken back into their time, which is the 23rd century. Uhura is like, I can raise the Enterprise on the communication device, and they're like, you found McCoy. This is wonderful. They're like, how long have we been gone? And they're just like, a couple of moments, really, whereas they had been there for 2 weeks. And they're like, what happened? And Kirk is just like, does not want to talk about it. And the guardian of the time gate says, all has been restored. You have no worries. You can go on with your life. And Kirk is like, let's get the hell out of here. And they beam up to the Enterprise. And it's an extraordinary story because it's about going back to correct something. But in that something that needed the correcting is a paradox or dilemma. I was always fascinated by this as a child because the message of Edith Keeler of worldwide peace is right. The fact that she's preaching it, the fact that it really goes on to become the Federation, which is Kirk and Spock and McCoy's world. It's the world of Star Trek. But it's at the wrong time. And this is one of the great conundrums of Uranus. The revelations or the twists or the breaks or the upsets that Uranus can bring can feel so wrong, and they can feel so wild, and they can feel so chaotic in the moment that we regard Uranus as almost a malefic, something that's negative and to be watched out for. But we don't necessarily always understand the necessity of that event, perhaps, the necessity of that decision, how we might have dodged a bullet, how if we hadn't gone into that experience that took us on a very difficult and dreadful journey, we wouldn't be where we are right now. So we have a question of like, what is there such a thing as a plan? Is there such a thing as a map? And we like to think with Uranus that there is, even though we don't recognize it in the moment. And that information, of course, lies on the other side of time. It lies in the realm of eternity, which Uranus is the planet that symbolizes that concept. But yet what we saw here was also going back to restore my time, okay? Kirk and Spock go back to restore their time, the time that is the right time for them. It might not have been the right time for everyone, or who knows? I mean, that's the great question that alternative universes and different timelines bring up and all these sorts of things. But it's an exercise of choice over my timeline and staying true to my timeline. So there's that wonderful Uranian dilemma, that is faced. But at the same time, we get the Venus coming out of retrograde. Venus in retrograde, and she turned retrograde in August 22nd. Okay, Venus retrograde, turning her back on love or peace or on good things in life. And so there's a feeling of being out of step with these things. It introduces all sorts of ideas that I brought up in previous broadcasts. But the idea with Venus now out of retrograde is that it's going to be restored. And there is in the story of Edith Keeler, and why it really connects to this Uranus, and why am I seeing a connection? Uranus is in the zodiac sign of Taurus, which is ruled by Venus, which is coming out of retrograde. In the story of Edith Keeler, she is this beautiful woman, this beautiful woman of peace, who is also the right idea at the wrong time. But what you have with the retrograde is that she was allowed, because of McCoy having gone back in time and stopped the traffic accident, which is what's understood that had happened. That's in the newsreel that Spock plays, where she goes on to become this consultant to FDR, that someone had saved her from a traffic accident, and that was indeed McCoy. the Venus coming out of retrograde is the restoration. And the restoration begs a sacrifice. And the sacrifice is Edith Keeler. In order for everyone else to live, in a future which is realized in interstellar peace and prosperity, which was the message of the first version of Star Trek, a sacrifice had to have been made. And this sacrifice, with the Venus going from a retrograde to now direct, the rectification of the proper timeline, the sacrifice is the love that Kirk has for Edith Keeler, that he could get lost in the past with her. I mean, if the future never comes to be, this is a beautiful woman that he very much loves. And he thinks about it for a moment, but then duty calls and he realizes, that that's not a choice for him, and that the sacrifice in that moment where he stops McCoy, who alters the timeline, that sacrifice and that pain is something that will never go away. So Uranus retrograde is kind of this idea of almost being given a second chance, or maybe even an opportunity to rectify what has come before. And Venus coming out of her retrograde is this restoration, things coming back to normal. Things may come back to normal in your love life. Things may come back to normal in your home life or in your professional life. But the normal that it comes back to is not going to be in the way that you expect. There will have been some kind of sobering revelation. There will have been some kind of sacrifice. There will have been an understanding that even if you could go back and change things, you can't change things because this is the way that life is supposed to play out. This is something that I want you to keep in mind and reflect upon this week as Uranus turns retrograde and is followed by Venus coming out of her months-long retrograde and resuming her course in the sky. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Horoscope Highlights. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Your support means a lot. See you next week.